Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 137, Meno 95b to c. Socrates has said more than enough to show Meno that virtue is not something teachable, and yet he carries on. His new argument will be that there are no teachers of virtue because no teachers can agree on whether virtue is teachable or indeed what virtue itself is. Fomen un tutus didascalus enai, tututu pragmatos, hois mede auto tuto homologetai, umoi doce, O Socrates. Shall we say that these are teachers of this matter, to whom not even this itself is agreed? It doesn't seem to me, Socrates. Here, once again, just as at the beginning of the dialogue, Meno is showing that he regards any subject as a concrete thing, and if teachers cannot agree on what it is, it means that they are not really teachers of it. He could have said that perhaps one of them is a teacher of it, but the others aren't. What would have been better would have been if Meno had stopped thinking so concretely and realized that a subject can be dealt with in many different ways, and each teacher takes one particular aspect of the subject. They do not all have to agree on what the subject is. Notice that this argument, just like every other argument in this dialogue, is led by Socrates. He asks the questions, but it is informed by the opinions of Meno. Socrates had been talking about civilians in Thessaly, and now he returns to the sophists. Tidede, hoi sophistai soi hutoi, hoi per monoi epangelon tai, docusi didaskaloi enai aretes? What then? These sophists of yours who alone proclaim themselves, in other words, to be teachers, do they seem to be teachers of virtue? When they had begun looking for teachers of virtue earlier, one of the criteria had been that the teacher should proclaim himself to be a teacher. This is something which ordinary citizens, both in Athens and in Larissa and other cities in Thessaly, don't do. They don't proclaim themselves to be teachers of arete, despite what Anytus seemed to imply. So perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that ordinary citizens don't agree on the subject matter and therefore are not really teachers. But what about the sophists? This is a good question. Well, it would be if not agreeing on the subject under discussion would be an indication that virtue is not something teachable. It has absolutely no relevance to whether virtue is something teachable, but let's play along with Socrates. In fact, Meno does have something interesting to say now. Kai gorgiu malisto Socrates tauta agamai, hoti ukan pote autu tuto accusais hupis chnu menu, ala kaiton allon kategela, hotan accuse hupis chnu menon. Ala legenoietai den poien denus. About this, Socrates, I admire Gorgias in particular, because you would never hear him promising this, but he even mocks the others whenever he hears them promising, in other words, to teach virtue. But he thinks he should make people speak well. Teaching people to speak well is probably how Gorgias himself taught rhetoric. He probably didn't have the name rhetoric yet. This is indeed the way Socrates described what Gorgias taught at the beginning of the dialogue. He could teach people how to appear to be wise by teaching them how to answer any question magnanimously and without fear. Meno now reveals that Gorgias had never claimed to teach virtue, and this is a bit of a surprise for us, because when Socrates said that he didn't know what virtue was, but Gorgias may have known, he asked Meno to tell him what Gorgias said about virtue, and at the time Meno didn't say that Gorgias didn't teach virtue. In fact, at the time, Meno said, well, it's no problem answering what virtue is. There's the virtue of the man, virtue of the woman, and so on. He had absolutely no problem saying what virtue is. But that actually is simply an example of what Gorgias taught. He could teach people to appear wise or to appear to be an expert by giving people the means to answer any question, whether they understand or not. If Meno in his first generous answer wasn't actually saying what virtue is, what was he saying? In fact, he was giving us prescriptive tasks, what people should do, what is expected of people who want to be good, categorized by age, status, and gender. It could be argued that Gorgias must therefore know what virtues are in order to be able to give such a long list of virtues. And all he's saying is that he doesn't teach people how to acquire those tasks, how to be good at those tasks. He's not going to teach a woman how to run a household, and he's not going to teach a man how to run a polis. So far as Gorgias is concerned, anybody will succeed in life after learning rhetoric, because that gives you the power of persuasion. People will do what you want them to do. People will be impressed by you and think that you're a good person simply by the way you talk. In other words, Gorgias is quite happy teaching people to appear to have virtue, to appear to be good. And this is something which he can teach. He knows that he cannot teach people to be really good, at least good in the traditional senses which he gave in his list of virtues. It should be noted that Gorgias knows even the list of quiet virtues: wisdom, justice, bravery, and self-control. And of course many more, because he's like that, he's very generous. But he would not teach people to be brave or just or any of these things. Given that Meno is quite taken with Gorgias, he thinks Gorgias is a wise man, and although he knows that Gorgias thinks that virtue is something not teachable, he still asks Socrates whether he thinks that virtue is something teachable among the other options, and this shows us that he is actually more interested in the opinions of people than in the thing itself. He isn't interested in whether virtue is something teachable, but he is interested in finding out who thinks that virtue is something teachable and who thinks that virtue is something which cannot be taught. We should observe that up to this very moment, Socrates has avoided giving his own opinion about whether virtue is something teachable. He keeps asking Meno what he thinks. Socrates provides food for thought, but he doesn't give his own opinion. Now that Meno has said that he's amazed in particular at Gorgias for not declaring his ability to teach virtue, as if such a wise sophist couldn't teach it, it does sound as though Meno himself thinks that Gorgias is being a bit coy. Socrates presses him for an opinion about the sophists. Ud arasoi dokusi hoi sophistai didaskaloi enai, uk echo legeno Socrates, kaigar autos hoper hoi poloi pepontha, totemen moi dokusi, totere u. So, don't the sophists appear to you to be teachers? I cannot say, Socrates, for I too have suffered in the way that the many have. Now the sophists appear to me to be teachers, and now they don't. Meno thinks that the many also have this impression from the sophists. They can't tell whether the sophists are teachers of virtue or not. This statement does indicate that Meno thinks that Gorgias may actually be a teacher of virtue. At least sometimes he appears to be, and at other times he appears not to be. Probably when he says that he can't teach, or he doesn't teach, or that virtue itself is something unteachable, and when he mocks those who do claim to be able to teach virtue. We should note the way that Meno reacts to Socrates' question about the opinions of other people. Do the sophists seem to you to be teachers? And Meno reacts, I cannot tell you, Socrates. This is the way Meno began the dialogue. Can you tell me, Socrates? Whenever Meno wants to find out the opinion of someone, he asks them if they can tell him. And now he, when asked for his opinion, says, no, he cannot tell Socrates. He doesn't know. Meno had said that Gorgias even mocks those who claim to be able to teach virtue, and this is a clear indication that the sophists themselves don't agree about the teachability of virtue. And therefore, when Socrates says, so do they seem to you to be teachers, this is supposed to be the conclusion. Given that they don't agree, and given that we've said that if people don't agree they are not teachers, then what do you say about these sophists? Are they teachers or not? And Meno should have said they are definitely not teachers because they don't agree. It looks like Socrates still has more work ahead of him.